the First World War, the war that started on horseback and ended with tanks. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe was in a state of tension. There were various ethnic groups living under the rule of empires, but they wanted independence and self-governance. You had empires conspiring against each other, competing to colonize the rest of the globe. There were also young nations that had recently emerged and wanted to challenge the old powers for dominance. Add to this a complicated network of alliances between all these governments, so complex that no one to this day can fully comprehend it. In short, Europe was like a pile of hay soaked in oil, just waiting for a spark to ignite and set it ablaze. That spark came in 1914. The Prince of Austro-Hungarian Empire, a man named Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was visiting a southern city of their empire called Sarajevo, which is now the capital of Bosnia. Security precautions were not as strict as they are today, so the Archduke and his wife were traveling in an open car to attend a celebration and a military parade in the streets of the city. This visit angered a group of Bosnians of Serbian descent because they saw Bosnia as Slavic land. The Slavs were the people who lived in these areas, by the way, and they believed that Bosnia should be ruled by its people, the Slavs, not by a foreign ruler from Austria. This group of Serbs conspired to assassinate the Austrian prince to send a message to the Austrian government. "We don't want you here." After a series of strange and somewhat humorous events, the young Serbs succeeded in assassinating the Archduke and his wife. This incident set off a whirlwind that turned the world upside down. The Austro-Hungarian government was furious at what had happened. In July 1914, they sent an ultimatum with severe demands to Serbia, one of which was that Serbia must open its borders to Austria and allow them to investigate and punish any groups they suspected of conspiring against them. No country would accept such a demand, and Serbia was given 48 hours to either comply or face consequences. Naturally, Serbia refused, so the Austrian government declared war on Serbia to teach them a lesson. Afterward, countries began to get involved. Russia had close political, religious, and ethnic ties with Serbia, as they were both Slavic nations, and decided it wouldn't let its cousin fight a war alone and prepared its massive army to defend Serbia. France also had good relations with Russia, so they declared that if Russia went to war, they would join as well. Austria had anticipated this, so before declaring war, it had already pulled Germany aside and asked it, "Hey, join me in this war." And Germany agreed, promising to protect Austria if anyone tried to intervene. So, when Russia started moving and mobilizing its troops, Germany bared its teeth and declared war on France. Germany's plan was that since Russia had a large and slow army that would take time to organize and reach them, or Austria, they would first strike at France, which was closer. The plan was to quickly defeat France before Russia could get involved, so they wouldn't have to fight a two-front war in both the East and the West. This plan is referred to in history books as the Schlieffen Plan, named after the person who devised it years earlier, in case Germany ever had to fight both Russia and France. But Germany had a problem with invading France. The border between Germany and France was heavily fortified, making it difficult to pass through easily. But if they passed through Belgium quickly, they could bypass these defenses and make a swift detour and boom, you are now in Paris. But Your Excellency the Kaiser, would Belgium allow the German army to march through their territory? Yes, don't worry. Belgium won't say anything or resist us. Our army is the best in the world. Germany massed its troops at the Belgian border and told Belgium, "Hey Belgium, we're just passing through to get to France. If we break anything, we'll pay for it later." But to their surprise, the Belgians said, "No, you can't enter our lands with your army even if you're just passing through." The Belgians fiercely resisted the German army, delaying their movement through Belgium much more than they had anticipated. Nations do not tolerate being used as bridges by foreign armies. And another small detail. Belgium had a defense treaty with Britain. So, Britain declared war on Germany as well. Let's quickly recap. Serbian nationalists killed the Austrian prince. Austria went to war to kick Serbia. Russia decided to defend Serbia because they were allies. France joined Russia because they were friends. Germany sided with Austria and declared war on France and Russia. On the way to France, Germany invaded Belgium. Britain, being Belgium's ally, declared war on Germany. All these nations decided to join the war. Austria and Germany were in the middle, and were thus called the Central Powers, Central Power. Their opponents were called the Allies, or the Triple Entente. Thus, World War I began. Germany was now trying to invade Belgium quickly, to pass through and reach Paris before Russia's massive army arrived from the east. But, as I mentioned earlier, they faced fierce resistance from the Belgians. Adding to Germany's problems, Russia mobilized its forces faster than expected and invaded eastern Germany. The German army in the east was initially caught off guard, but quickly reorganized itself and engaged Russia in the Battle of Tannenberg. In this battle, the Germans crushed the Russians. The Germans suffered around 13,000 casualties, but the Russians lost between 120,000 and 170,000 soldiers. This battle made the world realize that this war wouldn't be like previous ones. We were now in an era of artillery, machine guns, and precise military organization. Battles would grind soldiers down. Even though Russia's army was larger and had more weapons comparable to Germany's army, but it was disorganized, chaotic, and, most importantly, unable to quickly supply its army. This is something we would see repeatedly during the war. It doesn't matter how many soldiers you have or how advanced their weapons are if you can't manage them and provide them with supplies and ammunition. A gun is useless if it runs out of bullets. After all these battles, the Germans delivered another heavy blow to the Russians and pushed them out of their territory. Meanwhile, while Russia was suffering defeat at the hands of Germany, the situation was different against Austria. The Russians managed to invade Austria, inflicting heavy losses on them and forcing their army to retreat about 100 miles. In the south, Austria attempted to invade Serbia, the country they started the war with, but they embarrassingly lost and were forced to retreat. In short, Austria started the war by flexing its muscles but immediately lost against everyone. Elsewhere in the world, Japan decided to join the war and side with the Allies as a show of solidarity with Britain due to their close friendship. Nearby, there were a group of islands that Germany had colonized a while back, so Japan thought, why not take them? And they did. Japan took control of the islands, and that was almost the only thing Japan did in the war. It participated mainly to sit alongside the big powers and show that it was one of them. In Europe, Germany finally managed to occupy Belgium and continued its march toward France, advancing toward Paris. The British came to the rescue and teamed up with the French to stop the German advance. But the German artillery had a much longer range than theirs, so they were unable to stop them and were forced to retreat. The Germans got closer to Paris. The French realized this was no longer a joke. If the capital fell, the country would fall. With the help of the British, they reorganized their forces, gathering an enormous number of soldiers, nearly 1 million soldiers. Yes, 1 million soldiers. They entered into a battle with the German army, which now numbered around 900,000. 2 million soldiers fought for 6 days in what is now known as the Battle of the Marne. Since the French were near their capital, it was easy for them to supply their army with ammunition and provisions. The Germans, on the other hand, had been marching and covering long distances, so they were exhausted and couldn't continue the battle. They were forced to withdraw, and thus the French and British won the battle. Once again, the side that knows how to supply its army and handle logistics is the one that wins. But of course, both sides suffered enormous losses. Nearly 500,000 soldiers were wounded in this battle alone. As they retreated, the Germans realized something. If you dig a trench in the ground and stay inside it, enemy bullets and shells won't easily reach you. So they started digging trenches and established themselves near a river called the Aisne. The French did the same, digging their own trenches to face the Germans. The war settled into this form. Everyone stayed in their trench, trying to force the other side to retreat, but no one could. If you left the trench to attack, enemy bullets and shells would tear you apart. And if you tried to bombard from afar, your shells wouldn't significantly affect the enemy. The trench warfare strategy was so effective that armies became excited and dug a network of trenches that stretched from the sea in the north to Switzerland in the south. This type of fighting would later be called trench warfare, and it became the most iconic image of World War I. If you search for images of the First World War, the first thing you'll see is soldiers in trenches. Speaking of the sea, the war quickly reached the oceans. The British Navy, probably the strongest at the time, attacked the German fleet, sinking several German ships. The Germans, fearing them, decided to use submarines equipped with torpedoes, a new weapon at the time, to protect their maritime borders. These submarines proved to be effective, making the British hesitate to approach them. Later in the war, the Germans blockaded Britain, preventing any commercial ships from reaching them to starve them out. Moreover, out of spite, both countries filled the sea with mines to stop each other's movements. At this time, the Ottoman Empire, which was an old and troubled state at the time, it had been watching the war from afar without getting involved. However, its relations were better with the Central Powers. Germany approached them, saying, "Hey, will you help us in case Russia attacks Austria?" The Turks believed that the war might revive the empire and bring back its strength, so they bought ships from Germany and went to bomb the Russians. This angered the Russians as well as the British and the French, who then attacked the Turks, bringing the Ottoman Empire into the war. Hey, do you want to support the channel and at the same time you get some benefits like writing your name in the beginning and early access to the videos that I make? We want to inform you that we have opened the feature of membership and super thanks. If you want to support the channel in order for this content to continue, we invite you to join, the link in the description. Thank you. On the other side of the world, the British and Germans were engaged in naval battles around South America, once near Chile and once near the Falkland Islands, thus bringing the war to another continent. The Turks and Germans closed a waterway and cut off Russian wheat supplies to Britain, prompting Britain to send troops from India, Australia, and New Zealand to reopen the passage, but they failed. On the other side of the Ottoman Empire, British and Indian forces occupied Basra, aiming to control it. They sailed up the Tigris River to reach Baghdad, attacking some towns along the way. But before reaching Baghdad, the Ottoman army launched a fierce attack, forcing the British to retreat to a place called Kut, where the Ottoman army besieged them and forced them to surrender, capturing 10,000 British soldiers. Italy had been neutral throughout this period, but was eager to join the war, hoping to gain land or power afterward. They approached Austria. "Hello, Austria, can you give us a little bit of your land and in return, we'll help you in the war?" Austria replied, "You, go away." Hello, allies. And thus joined the war, spending a long time fighting against Austria until suffering a foolish defeat in a battle called Caporetto. I think it's pronounced Caporetto. At that time, hundreds of kilometers away, Germany was frustrated with its inability to achieve any victories against France on the Western Front. So it decided to launch a strong offensive to turn the tide of the war and exhaust the French forces. The target was a city called Verdun. If they took it, the road to Paris would open. The Germans prepared their equipment, aiming for this to be the largest offensive in German history and in human history. And the result was. After 9 months of fighting, neither side could make any progress. Neither the Germans nor the French. This is trench warfare in a nutshell. No matter what you do, the result is a stalemate. Meanwhile, a battle also took place between the Germans against the French and British near a river called the Somme. Both sides suffered heavy losses, especially the British, but the German army gradually retreated a few kilometers. In the west, Romania decided to join the Allies. Bulgaria joined the Central Powers, and the two nations kept fighting each other. Greece found itself surrounded by warring nations and said, "Yeah, why not?" They overthrew their king and joined the Allies. The European colonies in Africa saw battles and skirmishes between European soldiers throughout the war, which we can't delve into in detail, but it must be mentioned. On the Western Front, the British made slight progress against the Germans, so they decided to continue advancing with more large attacks. Wow! This time, they used tanks. Of course, as expected in trench warfare, nothing significant could be achieved. The British couldn't make much headway. If you notice, there's a sleeping giant that hasn't spoken yet. America. The United States had declared its neutrality from the start of the war and hadn't sent soldiers or declared war on anyone. But it had been lending money, vast amounts of money, to the Allies, Britain, France, and the Allies. The truth is that America's economy boomed during this war because it suddenly had customers buying weapons, food, and raw materials and borrowing huge sums of money. As the saying goes in banking, if you lend a small amount of money, you own the borrower, but if you lend a large amount, the borrower owns you. The Allies were deeply indebted to America, and because of this, America was worried. The Allies had to win to ensure that the governments remain in place and would pay back their debts. Germany, on the other hand, wasn't happy at all with America's involvement and its support for its enemies. To cut off the supply to Britain and starve them, it began sinking ships coming from America and heading there. On top of that, Germany sent a secret telegram to Mexico, America's neighbor, saying, "Hi Mexico, if you declare war on America, we'll support you financially and help you reclaim your lost lands from Texas and Arizona." Unfortunately for Germany, the British were spying on its telegrams and informed America of the plan. America realized it couldn't stay silent and had to deal with Germany, so it declared war on them in 1917. Of course, between America's declaration of war and the time it actually sent troops to Europe, there was a long gap because America then wasn't as powerful as it is today. It needed time to prepare for the war. While America was getting ready, Russia was suffering from many defeats and food shortages due to the war, leading to demonstrations, and a revolution that forced the Tsar to abdicate. Of course, Germany played a role in these demonstrations, but we don't have time to discuss that. The important thing is that Russia's new socialist government didn't want to continue the war, so they gradually withdrew, losing a large part of their territory and declaring peace with the Central Powers. The Allies were actually in trouble when Russia withdrew. Germany no longer had to divide its forces between East and West, and could focus on Britain and France. But the one thing that could give the Allies a chance to resist and restore balance was America. But America was slow and sluggish. Germany realized this too, and even though its forces were no longer spread thin after Russia's withdrawal, they were exhausted from the long war. America's arrival could tip the scales or even turn the table on them. If Germany wanted to win this war, it needed to end it before America's new forces arrived. There is no time. Now it doesn't have to reach Paris or even defeat its opponents. It just needed to make Britain and France say, "Okay, fine, let's negotiate." Germany gathered all its resources in a desperate offensive toward Paris, using everything it had: planes, bombs, gas, any weapon it could find. And as with all the battles on the Western Front, neither side could defeat the other due to the trenches. American forces finally arrived on the battlefield, but they didn't help the Europeans as much as they hoped. In short, they said, "We are an independent force and we don't care about anyone." But after some negotiation and a little scolding from the Europeans, America agreed to give them some of its soldiers and send more later. Romania was defeated by the Central Powers and signed a peace treaty. Germany and Austria began taking some of the territories that belonged to Russia. During this period, unexpected events started to occur. Firstly, Germany began to experience betrayals within its army from soldiers influenced by the Russian Revolution and its socialist ideas. The revolution that Germany helped ignite was now burning Germany. Secondly, a sudden global outbreak of a pandemic exhausted all the parties involved. The Spanish flu, the unknown soldier of World War I. This disease ravaged many countries, weakening their populations and armies that were already tired from the war. The nations could barely stand on their feet. Now we are in the final moments of the war. Finally, after a year of declaring war on Germany, the Americans entered the battles with their soldiers. They launched an offensive on Germany, in cooperation with France, Britain, and Italy. inflicting severe damage on the exhausted German army. Germany began to realize that the end was near. The Allies continued to advance, slowly achieving victories and pushing the Central Powers out of occupied territories like some areas in Serbia. Bulgaria, one of the Central Powers, announced its surrender. The Ottoman Empire also began to retreat, losing many territories, and uprisings broke out against it in the Arabian Peninsula and nearby regions, causing it to lose control over much land there. Britain took Baghdad, thus captured Iraq, and also took Jerusalem, engaging in battles with the Ottomans in Palestine and Syria, forcing them to withdraw. Eventually, the Ottomans requested peace negotiations. The French and British secretly signed an agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement to divide the Ottoman territories between them. And strangely, Britain announced something called the Balfour Declaration, which promised to establish a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. We all know that these agreements would never cause problems in the future. Some of the Austrian army began to mutiny, and more revolutions erupted within Germany, significantly weakening both nations. Germany and Austria found themselves facing reality. There was no hope of winning this war, so they reached out to the Allies to request an armistice and begin peace negotiations. The Allies, led by America, refused to negotiate until the Central Powers withdrew their forces from Belgium, France, and Serbia. After long and drawn-out negotiations, the nations finally reached an agreement and announced a ceasefire. The Paris Peace Conference, where the Treaty of Versailles and other treaties to end the war were signed, was controversial. One of its outcomes was that many countries were divided, lost territories, and a new international organization called the League of Nations was established to maintain world peace. You could say it was an early version of the United Nations. But most importantly, it was agreed at the conference to place all the blame for the war on Germany, which was now obliged to pay massive reparations to the victorious nations. Germany never saw this as fair and viewed it as a great insult. It was inconceivable for them to take all the blame alone, especially since other countries had entered the war before them and escalated the situation. Russia, for example. But they were defeated and had no power or influence to negotiate, so they were forced to accept the treaty against their will. Thus, World War I ended. Of course, we all know that imposing severe penalties on Germany and placing all the blame for the war on them will never lead to a furious German resentment that simmers within them for years and eventually brings us to